I love that little reminder. So give everybody a couple minutes to pop in. Make sure. Okay, we're right at 7 p.m. Eastern. So I want to say hello and welcome to everyone who's joining us live tonight or today, depending on what time zone you're in. More folks are rolling in right now, so we are going to do some quick introductions and get started, but I just wanted to welcome you all from the Marfan Foundation. My name is Angela Christ. I'm the director of the Loeys-Dietz Syndrome Foundation, which is a division of the Marfan Foundation. We are so pleased to get to offer this topic, to get to have this conversation tonight. Today, this is one of those topics that is, you know, it's a challenging discussion and one that, you know, it's not always the top of our list to want to talk about, but it's vital. It's vitally important. And so we're so grateful to our panelists and to all of you for joining us throughout the discussion. So there will be a little bit of presentation and then also some conversation from the panelists. And you are also welcome to drop your questions into the chat and I will watch those, or Q&A, either one is fine. I'll watch both to be able to share those questions with our panelists as we go on throughout the discussion. So with that, I would just like to first, I'm getting that there is a slight echo. Melissa or Maya, are you hearing an echo from me? Okay, Aaron, maybe, I'm not sure how to correct that issue. Zoom is sometimes our best friend and sometimes it fights with us. So let me know if that continues to be a problem for you. Oh, here comes Tony. Perfect timing. So we have all of our panelists here, and I first want to introduce Dr. Melissa Flint, who is joining us from Arizona. So when I say this evening, I know darn well that I am putting her in the wrong time zone. And I will let her introduce herself a little bit more fully, but she is from Midwestern University, and works in behavioral science, especially around the areas of grief and trauma. And has worked closely with the Loeys-Dietz community, Marfan community, and some with the VEDS community as well. So sort of uniquely positioned to have this conversation. Our friend Maya Brown-Zimmerman is joining us this evening as well. Today, I keep saying this. She is a mother who was diagnosed as a child with Marfan and is also raising her own children who also who also lived with Marfan and some other challenges. So we are pleased to get to have her very unique perspective as a member of the community and also one as a mom of a member of the community. She has 4 children and, then she has tons of spare time, obviously, because that's what 4 children affords you. And then we are also being joined by Dr. Tony Yasick, who is an anesthesiologist. And I just want to point out that I'm really proud of myself for saying that correctly, because I always fumble my consonants there. He's also the chair of the Defy Foundation and is a member of the Marfan Foundation board and lives with vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or VEDS. So these are our panelists. Melissa is going to kick us off. Dr. Flint is going to kick us off with a little bit of presentation, and then we're going to go back and forth between some of the, sort of data and theory around grief and trauma and grieving, and then weave back and forth between that and some thoughts from our panelists and their lived experiences with this. And again, if you're just joining, if you have questions throughout with this, please do drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring those to pass on to our panelists. So with that, Dr. Flint, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Melissa is just fine. Hello, everybody. And I accept the evening accolades because it's 4 o'clock here. And y'all, it's 117 degrees in Phoenix. So I'm looking forward to when the sun goes down. So I work at Midwestern University, and I've had the pleasure of working with multiple kind of facets of the Marfan Foundation and the associated foundations since one of the very first regional symposiums, which was held in Phoenix, gosh, back in like maybe 2015-ish, somewhere there. And you know what? I fell in love with y'all for so many different reasons, and was so surprised that it's been hard to find psychologists that are kind of willing to venture into this area. My connection, unfortunately, is the topic that a lot of people don't love to talk about. I'm a thanatologist, so that just means I have board certification in death and dying and bereavement. That's my entire private practice. And I will be honest with you, we are doing the ultra super light version of grief education today. People spend years and still need to keep learning about this particular topic because it's so individual and there's no right path. And as much as we want somebody just to lie it out for us and know exactly what we need to do, and then we'll be all better, that doesn't kind of happen with grief. So we're going to talk about some of these things today. And there's questions that we've talked about and things that we're kind of just going to banter about as we move through. And I'm looking forward to what everybody kind of has to think about some of the things we talk about. So probably most of you, if you had Psych 101 back in the day, you talked about Kubler-Ross and 5 stages of grief. And I use the whole air quote thing because Elizabeth never wanted these to be stages, because stages implies you do one and then you do the next and you do the next. And oh my God, thank goodness we're done. And that is not at all how this was or how it ever meant to be. We've adapted that wording though, because most people understand it as stages, but I want to throw in a couple of caveats to this. They're not stages, they're not linear. It's actually kind of more tornadic. You kind of start at the bottom and you go up and then you come back down and then you get stuck somewhere and then you move forward again with some momentum, and sometimes it's really slow. So everybody does these stages, so to speak, a little bit differently. We don't need to go through all the stages either. That's another misnomer. I have patients all the time coming to private practice going, but I really haven't been angry. You might not be. Another person might be very. And so giving us that space to acknowledge that somebody else's existence in grief might be different than ours, just like somebody else's existence with Marfan or VEDS or whatever else it might be different than ours, is kind of an important grace place for us to try and reside in. Stages can occur over and over again, not just once. I was never going to be a grief chick, as they call me here on campus. But when I was in grad school, I actually experienced the death of my first son. And it was abundantly clear that my life mission needed to change based on that experience. And I have learned firsthand that you go back through things. It was the 20th anniversary just a few weeks ago, and I found myself doing some early grief stuff again. And that was really quite normal and didn't take as long. And you kind of cycle through when you need to. And as long as you can touch those places and be okay with grief, kind of being part of life, it's much easier to kind of make it through versus feel victimized by. You don't need to follow the stages at all. You can completely do it your own way. That's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. And all the people with the Hallmark cards that say you must do it X, Y, and Z, you can just tell them thanks, but no thanks. Because we each need to honor ourselves and the people we love in doing it our own way. You might have emotions that are different than are even listed here, even though these are kind of the foundational things we talk about, that denial and anger and bargaining, just take me, don't take my child. Depression, which can look very different for many different people. Sometimes depression is hyper, negativity, and other times people are in bed catatonic and can't even get out of bed and shower. And I want to caveat this idea of acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean it's okay. Acceptance means it is what it is. I have lost this person. They've died. I miss them desperately. It's almost an acceptance and acknowledgement of what you're feeling versus kind of accepting and forgetting, which is what we taught people years ago. We actually taught people to go home and remove all the items that were associated with the person, as if somehow that would not remind you that they're gone. We know that that's not accurate any longer, and we're doing much better with this idea of meaning making, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But I did want to point out acceptance is kind of like one of those words like forgiveness that some people have a religious connotation with. And if I forgive, then I must forget. And that's not exactly the true honor of that stage. So Angela, let's talk about this a little bit. What do you think?
So I'm curious. So, sort of one of the unique characteristics of our community and those living with one of our the conditions that we serve is that this idea of over and over again. When you were talking about that, I was thinking, so you definitely go through that with an individual person, but then we're also re-entering in over and over again as members of this community, as we unfortunately lose people. So Maya or Tony, whichever one of you would like to go first, I would be curious, of your thoughts on that. How does that idea strike you, or what comes to mind with that notion?
Go ahead, Maya.
I think in some ways, I'm 36 and I've been in this community since I was 13. I'm used to the process and how it's kind of all over the board with grief. So when I, lose another loved one, I know there's a familiarity with the process. Although that doesn't change, it doesn't make the process go faster or easier. But there's also a fatigue and a heaviness that I feel along with it, because knowing that it isn't like with people who aren't in a chronic illness community where, you lose your grandmother or a friend and that's your experience with death for a long time. This is something that happens too frequently. And so there's a heaviness that goes along with that, knowing that it's not going to just be a one-time or two-time thing. The grief is always kind of there.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with that. I think that's sort of one of the super challenging elements of these kinds of problems in serving the community and in your family, which is that I'm familiar with the grief stages, like I think probably everybody is, and I think you never you're gonna have to do it again probably somewhere, and that's a burden, and that's a challenge for sure. But I would say, I think also relating to the stages that you said as you were working through them, I think everybody is super, super individual about how they approach these things, work through these things, how they feel these things. But it's a unique burden to the grief process, which I'm miles from an expert, except personally on. It's a unique thing here that you're not. It's on and on. That's not the way it is. It's not the way it is in my professional life, right? We do surgery, fix a broken leg, and then you recover, right? But that's not how this works, and it doesn't. It may not work that way for individual episodes of grief, but it certainly doesn't work that way for multiple episodes.
That compounding effect, I think, adds to the weight you guys are both talking about, the heaviness, the weight is, and the foreknowledge that it will happen again. We're all human, so we're all going to lose people, right? That's just part of the human experience. But in this community, the reality of that happening more often and younger is the reality. And so that heaviness, that's a great way to kind of describe it, I think.
I would comment on that we're all going to, that notion we're all going to lose someone. I think we're going to talk about it later probably, but there's often, what's good to say, what's not good to say, what's helpful. I think one of the least helpful things I've often always heard is from people who are trying to be helpful is kind of, well, we're all going to die someday. This could happen to us. And whenever I hear that, I think, no, that's not going to happen to you, right? You don't have something hanging over your head that probably is going to get you or get someone else that you care about. And so in terms of others dealing with it or others interacting with it or how we can be helpful to each other, I think we're all individuals, but for me, I've always found that the least, I know it comes from a good heart for people, but I find it the least, well, we could something could happen to all of us tomorrow. And I think, well, no, that's not going to happen to you, but it may to, people in our community.
Those platitudes, I think, are so prevalent because of society's fear of talking about death.
Right.
I am so proud this organization is willing to dive into this topic because I get asked to talk all the time and say things like, can you not say death or grief while you're like, no, this is the reality of it. But I have nothing against Hallmark. I tend to say Hallmark platitudes, but they come from a variety of reasons. One of my favorites that I've seen is, or heard over and over in those kind of, and again, people are well-meaning, they just don't know what to do or say, and we'll talk more about that. But the idea of God needed another angel in heaven. Right. And, my favorite though is, oh yeah, that's kind of like the time when my hamster died.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not actually at all, but thanks for offering that.
Right.
Angela, are there any comments in the chat box that we should stop here and address or kind of keep moving forward? Put her on the spot. She wasn't expecting that. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. We have one question here, but I think we're going to cover it. Erin, I see your question. And if we don't hit this a little bit, we'll circle back.
Perfect.
Otherwise, we're good. Let's keep
Perfect.
Going.
So Dave Kessler is another person who started working early on while Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was still alive. And they looked at the stages and they said, wait a minute, we're kind of missing something. And the last missing piece, and again, you could apply many others, but this idea of meaning making. And that doesn't mean, again, that it's okay. It doesn't mean that anybody should ever die from a Marfan related disorder. It's not that, but it's about us as grievers figuring out what this now means for me, being a mother of a child who's died, or a spouse, or a grandparent, or whomever, whatever the relationship is, a friend from conference, it could be anybody. And meaning making doesn't minimize the profoundness of the loss. Meaning making allows us to do something, and I'll try and do the visual, but when you're first bereaved, when you first have that moment of losing somebody or losing somebody again from the same reason, we restrict, we contract, we pull into ourselves, we try and protect. It's almost like the visual of the turtle sucking back into a shell, right? You get really tight because nothing is safe, and oh my God, the world has just fallen apart. As we grieve and start making meaning of that, which can mean anything at all, our vessel opens and we can again contain joy and sorrow. We can then have those moments where we look back on, our beloved with tears and laughter at exactly the same time. That's actually what I look for in grief work with a person who's progressing, is when we are kind of starting to talk about, now, what does life look like without this person? And how can I make meaning? How can I do something in honor? How can I continue to have their name show up in this world because it matters? How can I take control over what was uncontrollable in their death by how I'm going to live my life, by what I've learned from them or what I admired from them? Or there's so many different ways to spin this. But meaning making is an interesting newer construct in grief work. And the beauty of it is it can be anything for anybody. When people ask me about my experience with child death, not from a connective tissue Marfan related disorder at all, but it kind of in that same vein, people are, oh my God, I don't know how you survive. Oh, I don't, this and that. And you have to keep moving forward in some way. And some people move forward with more positive momentum, and some people move forward and or don't move forward and they're kind of stuck. Meaning making helps us kind of have some momentum moving forward. Some people are highly offended when we talk about meaning making as it relates to death. Some people are like, oh my gosh, that's it. That's the missing key. That's what I'm not doing. And it seems to make a lot of sense for them. So I don't know. What do you guys think about this concept of meaning making?
I wonder if a lot of people are doing it without knowing they're doing it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
yeah.
Whatever way you end up, whatever coping in the end,
yeah.
That's probably what you're doing.
Yeah.
For me, it's keeping people, keeping some of them alive, right? So that's the meaning to me, right? Because I think you recognize that you're right, we're not all going to be here, but when you see people close and young die, then you know what's really left of people, right? And that's relationships and love and those things. And so I think, for me personally, I think people probably do that more instinctively than in some specific
and often not right
action.
out of the gate, right? Because you need time for that
I think
depth.
I would guess not very often. Right?
Yeah.
I would guess, take some time.
Yeah.
And I think it's so intensely personal. And I've had multiple people to me over the years, with various losses say, well, everything happens for a reason, and try to insert their meaning into my grief.
Yes.
Which I think is such a dangerous thing to do. Because then my response comes back, some things just happen because it's life, because this is how our bodies are, and this is something that happens sometimes. But with time, like you said, Melissa, I have been able to, make meaning of my relationship with them and what that's meant for my life, or sometimes how I'm going to change things going forward. So when I was 13 and I lost my best friend to dissection, then I decided I'm going to become an advocate and try to change the system that is the reason that we lost her, which is a very idyllic, 13-year-old thing to do. But it has, affected how I've gone for, the past 20 some years. So I think meaning making can be large or small, but it has to be the person who's grieving who makes that meaning.
I think you hit on my second least favorite comforting phrase. There's a reason for everything. Maybe that's number one. I don't know, but it also probably from a good place, but I personally don't find that helpful. And I don't think most people do. And I think not only does it, for the reasons you mentioned, Maya, but also I work in healthcare. I know people pray and care and worry about their loved ones, and bad things still happen, right? And that intention, or with intent to be kind, you're kind of letting people think, well, maybe the reasons are not good, right? Maybe the reasons are you. Maybe the reasons are something you did or didn't do right. And that's not a helpful place for most people, I don't think.
You hit the nail on the head in that regard. We know that when people say those kind of things, they're distancing themselves from your grief, because if it could happen to you, could it happen to me? But if you did something wrong, AKA didn't take your meds, didn't follow up, didn't get the surgery, didn't take the vaccine, didn't do this, there could be a million things. there's a way for them to distance and say, okay, whoo, so that's not going to happen to me. Good. I feel really sorry, but everything happens for a reason. And that's awful. We need to erase that from our vocabulary.
That just needs to go away.
Yeah, I don't use it.
Maya, I love how you talked about that, how you make meaning or have made meaning for one loss is different than how you would for another too, because it dovetails with the relationship you had with that person, or maybe what kind of person they had been, either in your life or in someone else's. I think that's a really important point to make, because how we need to make meaning for ourselves very well depends on who we are at the time and who that person was to us, right? And I love 13-year-old idyllic Maya, because look how much
You're doing it.
Yeah.
There's something else that's floating in my head as you guys were just talking about that public versus private grief and public versus private meaning making. At first, we want the world to stop with us and go, oh my gosh, this has happened. And we often feel very betrayed in lots of different ways when we must return to work within 3 days. Otherwise, we lose our job, or we must, all the kind of must, or somebody comes up to you and say, oh, you look so good. And they don't know that it's taken you 6 hours to shower and dress, and you still didn't get deodorant on, like just life things, right? And slowly grief will move to more private. There's that initial vitriol of please everyone stop and acknowledge, and then the failure sometimes of many times of that to happen. But the same thing happens in our meaning making. At first, it might be big things, like people are posting on Facebook, I'm raising money for Marfan, or I'm raising money for VEDS, or whatever else, or I'm using my Amazon Smile dollars, or it might be very public and they're posting about it. Eventually, I think the really great meaning making, and this is perhaps a misjudgment on my part, but the ones that really are meaningful are some of those private ones that nobody else knows about except for you and the recipient. Say if you're doing a random act of kindness, or it's just kind of an inside joke between you and the person that you've lost. Those are the powerful ones. And you will move to a point eventually where you don't necessarily need the whole world to acknowledge. You'd love that, for them to say your loved one's name and remember them. But we can also do that very powerfully, privately, in very sacred, beautiful ways.
Love that. I have a question here from Kay Frost. They say the meaning making perspective makes sense emotionally and intellectually about how to begin a dialogue with a child of a Marfan patient that has dealt with the parent loss due to Marfan. The child is not open to any dialogue or space for that pain or loss. I'm going to guess this is a little bit going to depend on the age of the child, but there is that. It's a good question.
I think the peer support in those situations becomes even more critical, because kids often don't think that the adults can understand. They do have nuances and differences in lots of ways, and kids don't just grieve like little adults. They grieve in very different ways. And just because the kid is shut down doesn't mean they're not grieving. We can't make that justification either. But that kind of meaning making evolves very organically with kiddos often. They're so remarkable. When it's a parent, some of the starting places are, remembering to talk about mom or dad, remembering to include them in ritual of the family, remembering to openly, the times where there's tears because you remember something sad that you miss, and then the joy of the funny thing that happened at Disneyland last year or the last holiday or whatever. It's kind of starting to move that balance from it all being the sad, terrible, awful parts of it to being it's all still sad and terrible, but gosh, I do remember that time. And I do remember this. And this is the trait of my dad that I want to have as I grow up. Kind of some of those things. Sometimes kids, more often than even adults, need that individual therapy experience too, with a super good kiddo psychologist or a master's level person. There's lots of techniques that we use in therapy that stop us from needing kids to put words to stuff that they don't have a vocabulary to talk about yet. They can play it out. They can, use the doll set and dad's not there anymore. And what does that mean? And act through that. And some of those outlets can be super important, especially for the littler kids who they just don't have the vocabulary to even tell you what they're necessarily feeling or thinking.
Well, I have no expertise with the psychology of your children, but I sure think adults don't know when it's okay to talk about, it's okay to bring it up.
Yeah.
It's okay to laugh about it. They don't know how to do that well, right? So I'm sure kids need even more guidance to kind of walk through that, because that's a challenge for everyone interacting with or going through things themselves or interacting with them is when's it okay to talk? Is it okay to talk about? Is it okay to laugh about? Laughter is a tremendous medicine.
Oh my gosh. When we look at the science behind laughter, the endorphins that are released are natural antidepressants. Let's use them. I mean, it doesn't mean you're laughing about it or you're not missing them. The hole in your soul that they once resided in is still there. It's just
I laugh with them. That's what I think. I'm laughing with them.
Oh,
that's
gosh,
what I think,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I was older probably than the child that you're asking about, but in my experience, my grief manifested itself really differently than what my parents expected. And so I think it's important to make room, like Melissa said, for the child's emotions, whether you think that's how grief should look or not. It's how it's manifesting for them. If they're old enough, it can be helpful to write. I just wrote letters to Sandy for months and months. I wouldn't talk to my parents about it because I felt like they wouldn't get it, but I journaled through it, which was helpful. And when my son lost his first friend to Marfan, which I know is not the same as a parent, and he was 5, and in the course of a year lost his friend, his doctor, and multiple grandparents. And so we had a few different tools that we used to help him in addition to therapy. So he had a doll that he would hug, and when he hugged the doll, it was like, we told him that the family in heaven, if that's something that you believe in, would be able to feel the hug. And so that was a helpful tool for him. And there were a lot of books that we used on grief that were designed for little kids that were helpful too.
The invisible string is a really powerful one. I got no kickback from this, but it talks about no matter where the person is at. So it can be separation anxiety, it can be death, it could be divorce. It really could be any concept. There's an invisible string that ties my heart to your heart. And whatever belief systems of afterlife we have, oftentimes that speaks to kids that there's still, I'm not abandoned on the island by myself. There still is a connection and there still is love.
That's the book we use too.
I love that book. I should get a kickback. I talk about it a lot. All right. This is one of the infographics, one of many that I share with patients and family and friends and the people who Facebook me and say, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. Wow. This is kind of grief. This is all of it. There's a part where you need hugs and there's a part that you recoil. There's a part where you have emotional outbursts and there's a part that you are quiet and contemplative in yourself. There's shock. There's that autopilot. I love that this one includes something called gnashing of teeth, kind of a way to express that, the deep soul sorrow that we feel when we lose people, especially very close to us. Weird behavior, what we don't expect. You might even surprise yourself. Memory stuff, the searching, constantly thinking you've heard or seen. You know how when somebody you love has died and you're just sitting there by yourself and you kind of look and it's almost like they've just been there. Or, and I'm not talking about like possession and ghost kind of things. I'm talking about we are so connected with the people that we love deeply. That connection does not cease in death. We still have that peace in us. And some people choose to stay busy. Some people get really angry and then even more angry. Some people get scared. And you'll notice that the line does not go loss, shock, auto, it's all over. Does this resonate with you guys as far as the grief journeys you've had? Any thoughts
Go ahead,
about
Maya.
it?
Yeah, I think that each one has been unique, but this up and down and all around process has been common. It's a common thread amongst all of them. And I'm not always prepared for what's going to pop up when, you know, whether I want a hug or I get really mad if my husband tries to offer one because I just want to be completely alone, or they can't remember anything, is one that comes up a lot, that can last for a while. So yeah, I think that definitely fits my experience.
All over the board, right? I mean, I think, and again, I would say very individual, right? Like Maya mentioned, but I'm sure I personally have felt probably everything on that list over the years. But yeah, everybody's different.
Everybody's different, and everybody will have different words on their things. So one of the reasons that I brought this up is something that we all can do in our grief journeys, as we think about those we have lost and how we've responded to that. Blank piece of paper, scribble through the middle, and then start identifying what words are appropriate to you. And that kind of goes with the next one, that there's so many feelings of grief, but you always need to leave an open circle or circles for the person to fill in what it is that their experience is, and not assume it or predict it for them. Because some people might not actually ever feel the numbness. Some people might only feel the numbness for a while. Fatigue, this one includes boredom, which I think is so interesting because it's kind of that disconnect. If I act bored in a way, I'm disconnecting from the pain. And so it's socially acceptable to act withdrawn if you're bored. It's not socially acceptable to act withdrawn if you're grieving. Isn't that ironic? And not very supportive. The pain on here can be emotional or not. I've had many people who have physical pain normally associated somewhere with the area of their loved one's death. So in these cases, a lot of people talk about like chest pain and or neck or head or whatever it might be. It's very, grief is powerful. Grief is powerful. What feeling would you guys insert here that speaks to your story? Stories.
Frustration. Frustration is one that I thought of. I was trying to think, what have I felt that didn't fit in the box? And that would probably be one, because to me, it's a little bit different than anger. Yeah. But I just have a short, I don't have very much patience. And so I get frustrated easily when I'm grieving.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I would maybe echo that, but I would say one I don't see there, but desperation. Right. So I think when you, especially in these kind of diagnoses, because it's not, sort of feels like it's never the end, right? Which is what you mentioned earlier. But so for me, it makes you feel very, very desperate for the folks that you've lost, but desperate going forward too, right? So I that's the word I would put in there.
I can imagine some professional desperation as well in trying to be a healer on top of other things.
Yeah, for me personally about that, and I think when you're faced with strong sense of mortality, and you've seen mortality up close. I mean, for me, I don't know if you know, but all of my brothers have passed away, and we were close friends. When you see that up close, I think for sure it makes you desperate for to maintain those relationships. But I think it can go both ways. So for me professionally, it makes me think I want to do a better job of being a more compassionate, empathetic caregiver. But I think there is a part of you that, if you're not careful, can be knowing that sense of shortness can also turn you into impatient. I think just maybe the way Maya was saying, right? I mean, I think when maybe you're more inclined, and when you're cut off in traffic, there's a part of you that's more inclined to say, who cares? And then there's a part of you that's more inclined to say, life is short and I'm not taking it. And I think you got to fight that guy, right? The second one. because I think that can come about and take over some of your better instincts.
Some other words, a couple of folks dropped into the Q&A and chat were abandoned and guilt.
When I saw that in the chat, I thought, oh my gosh, how is guilt not on this list already? Because I think especially in our community, there's survivor's guilt. Like, why am I here when, you know, so-and-so was so good and they didn't deserve this? And so feeling, you know, that guilt of being alive. But then also sometimes there's guilt of, I could have said this or said that, and maybe that would have changed the outcome, you know. And I mean, I don't know for the person that put it in there, but I have definitely felt guilt a lot of times. And it can be easy to feel abandoned when somebody you're really close with has passed on and you're left without their guidance or their laughter or their advice.
Yeah, guilt for sure, right? Things left unsaid, things left undone, right?
What about the genetic component guilt? Is there any of that? I've often heard people talk about, you know, I have a disease process that there's a high likelihood to be passed on, and that's what happened. And now I feel guilty about that. Is that anything that either one of you can speak to?
It's not something that I've felt, but I think I'm in the minority. Because although we knew that it was a possibility, it wasn't something I consciously chose. And so my feelings about it have been, it's something that happens. My son happened to inherit it from me, but we're in a position where we have these tools and these connections and these coping skills that can be passed on. And so he's off to a much better start than I was, getting diagnosed later. And so to me, that overrides the guilt.
I think it was the Houston conference. That feels about right, where we were having a discussion in between one of the sessions that was about this. And one of the people that were there talked about the fact that the judgment that they received from others for having a family and being happy and still doing the things they've always wanted to do was one of their hardest hurdles to overcome, because everybody, you shouldn't have kids because you could do this, as if there was some sort of wish that gets passed on. And it was an interesting conversation with a lot of tears, that people were carrying burdens provided by others that were based in their opinions and not in the reality of the experience that you all get to have and choose to have.
We got that a lot.
Did you?
And continue to have over the years. But my response is that by saying that, you're telling me that you don't think my life is worth living. And I have lots of surgeries and I have pain and I have these negative things, but then there's all these great things too. And when I was pregnant with my first, and I had this moment of being panicked that he was going to be at a disadvantage having a mom who had days of immense pain or had these surgeries or had this unknown future. And my husband said, well, there aren't any perfect parents, but you can have perfect love, and we will just love this baby, and the rest will work itself out. And so sure, my kids are at a disadvantage, you know, sometimes because of issues with my condition, but I think there are positive things they've gotten from it too. So I wish everybody could see that disability is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, even though it can be hard.
Yeah.
Probably two different things, right? Living with a diagnosis yourself and living with grief, right? And there's probably a whole different conversation or continuing conversation about living with sort of the grief of your own diagnosis, right? And my opinion about that, for sure, even more so than the rest, is that there surely is no right answer for how people cope with that. that knowledge, right? And so for some people, I would say for me personally, the personal diagnosis is probably more of a grief challenge than more normal or more easy to understand, I guess, grief processes that go there. I think people don't understand. Would you want to know? Do you want to know your diagnosis? Right? I can say categorically, I did not, wish I never did. And that's for sure probably not the consensus in our community, right? In our scientific community, right? So, and yeah, I think how you approach the diagnosis or passing it on or still being here when others are not, those are pretty unique situations.
So the
That's
person
actually
who
a
put in
question.
abandonment. Oh, go ahead.
That was actually a question in the Q&A too, is how did each of you handle the grief of getting your own diagnosis?
Mine has been cyclical in some ways because I was 8 when I was diagnosed and I didn't really understand what it meant, but my parents didn't give me space to be able to grieve it because they were so busy grieving it. And it was something that I was told not to talk about with anybody. So my extended family didn't even know that I had this until like I was in college. Even though I had all these surgeries, my parents just were reluctant to talk about it. And so I kind of had to figure that out on my own, but then in different life stages, I've grieved it all over again. And so with dating and navigating that, there was a lot of grief about my diagnosis. And with having kids and it not being the way that I would have liked it to go, there was grief with that. And as I'm getting older and I'm having more things go wrong with my body, there's a grief process again. Even my sister-in-law, like, we're done having kids. Like that is done. And I'm happy about that. But my sister-in-law got pregnant with her first last year and was talking about choosing the hospital that she wanted to deliver at. And I was so sad. I mean, not in front of her, but afterwards, because that was never an experience I got to have. I got told, this is the hospital you're delivering at. This is the OB that you're going to have. This is how it's going to go. And there were no options because of being a high-risk pregnancy and needing to do what had to be done to take care of myself and the baby. But that was an experience I would have liked to have. And so sometimes the grief about the diagnosis comes up in odd ways, but it definitely hasn't been a one-time thing.
Well, I think the other thing about that, for maybe an answer to one of the panel questions, is that I think people have either grief or regret or anxiety about what they could have done, right? And or what they should have done, or what people think they should have done. And I think one of the challenging things about many of these diagnoses is that there are certainly things we can do, but there are also challenging diagnoses. So the part that you're responsible for is maybe not always as much as you like to think in terms of your decision making. So yeah, I think the woulda, shoulda, coulda going forward probably is a natural feeling, but probably not very helpful, especially I guess in these kinds of diagnoses, right? And I would say in my professional life, you can kind of maybe I should have come in earlier because of my appendicitis and it would have turned out a little better. A lot of these decisions for these kinds of diseases are not that simple. And so this sort of feeling bad about the decision making, I think is probably not that fruitful anyways, because in some cases, at least, you're not impacting as much as you worry.
So the person who said abandonment, I didn't want to ignore that one. I wanted to say this about it. When we study grief circles after somebody significant has died, there's something that we anecdotally call the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is that a third of the people in your circle are going to hang around and they're actually going to do the best they can. They might not be always there, but they have the good intentions and they're bringing the meals and they're hugging and they're telling you they love you and whatever. A third of your circle will say they're going to be there and then never show up again because they have no idea how to deal with your grief. And then the other third never show up at all. And of course, don't do the math and apply that, but it's a global kind of thing. And I think the more that I've talked to people in that have deaths related to medical conditions and different, really, I love how you say challenging diagnoses, because they are not insurmountable, but definitely challenging. There's a lot more of that. Instead of it being 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, there's almost like the people that stick with you, and then there's people who don't. There's this mass exodus that happens, and you wonder what happened and why people can't be more supportive. And that's part culture, part fear, part lots of things. Believing in the sparkly rainbows, that if you only focus on that, life will be great and we won't have to look at any of these bad things that happen. The fact that bad things happen to great people, all these other things that people think somehow insulate them from trauma and loss. So yeah, that idea of abandonment can be really, really powerful. So I didn't want to negate to acknowledge that, for sure. Were there any other things, Angela?
I just wanted to mention on that one too, that I think for our community, and Tony and Maya, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but what I feel like I've seen is that abandonment is what you're speaking to, Melissa, but it also can be, you know, we were in this together, we had the same condition or similar, and we were, you know, doing life together. We understood each other's challenges and pains, and now I am living it by myself because you're gone.
Yeah. I think it's both. I think that there are definitely friends that I've lost where I felt that way. Like Carmela, we had, like, you created this group of Carms Kvetchers, and now you're not here. And this was your group for us to like bitch about having Marfan. And so it's not quite the same without the ringleader. But then too, like what Melissa said, when you have this condition that impacts so much of your life, not only are there people that don't want to stick around or don't know how to handle when you're grieving because you've just lost this friend or your family member, but they don't know how to handle the grief of the day-to-day, like that your body's not working the way that you want it to, and you're having a lot of pain, or you need another surgery, or, you know, something else has gone wrong, and they like, it's too much drama for them or too much trouble. They can't wrap their head around somebody just having all of these things happen because they don't understand the diagnosis. And so then they peace out. And that can be really hard because we do need kind of a different kind of ongoing support than maybe some other people do who have perfect health.
People don't know what to do, right? And they don't know what to say a lot of times. And I'm not great at it, but I just try to give them the grace to give people in general the grace to realize most people's hearts are pretty good. A lot of times whatever third they fit into is just a reflection of their capabilities, not really, you know, so much you or your relationship. And you know, a lot of people have good hearts. They just don't know what to do and or what to say. And in some ways, I at times feel for them, you know, as much as because they want to do or say something helpful, but they don't have it to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Angela, I am trying to watch the time. How much longer do we have together? About what? I'm lip reading, and I think she said 40 minutes. Okay, just wanted to make sure. I'm
Sorry.
Testing a new skill today, lip reading. So this is something that Angela and I talked about early in this development process of talking about this, and it's not really anything necessarily that's kind of in the text or in the book. So hey, we might be creating something here. So I definitely want your feedback on this idea, but this idea of kind of ripples and momentum. And so when you've lost somebody, your parent, your best friend, your sibling, your child, you're at the epicenter. You are the most pain. It's your loved one. I don't know how I'm even gonna, kind of take a deep next breath kind of pain. And then there's people who are a little bit more removed, a little bit farther out in those ripples, and it's still painful, but maybe not as much. You can compartmentalize, oh, Joe was a great guy, whatever those kind of things might be, but you're not in the kind of epicenter, in the turmoil of it necessarily. And then there's other people that are kind of out there, and you might know them, but you don't know them. And this is something that I am rallying against with all my being, the idea of a one-click condolence. The more we have social media and the more people share about their grief on social media, there's this phenomenon of, if I just share the sad face, whew, good, my grief support is now done. And that is absolutely not what any of us need in any type of grief, but especially medical chronic condition kind of grief. The sad face on the death announcement doesn't do it.
Don't you think that some of that is contributed to by social media allowing us to make sure we announce our hamster death and our other kinds of grief, I guess.
For sure.
So that allows people to kind of get comfortable with that minimal, I guess, one-click condolence,
Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. The problem is really when you guys as a community and when you connect together and you have people that have very similar experiences, or you look at them and go, is that what it's going to be like for me when I'm a decade older or whatever it might be? You are past this, or for at one stage that's sad. There's no real connection. You're very far from, but for you guys, you are also at the epicenter when somebody who has your same diagnosis dies, because how can you not go, oh my gosh, this is just a reminder of what can happen to me. This is a reminder of what's happened to my siblings. This is a reminder of what's happened to my friends and loved ones. And so it kind of draws us from being out in those other ripples right into the center. And that can be a very difficult place to find yourself revisiting constantly. You guys were just sharing that there had been several unfortunate losses in just the last little while. And the cumulative response of that feels, I would assume, really, really heavy as an organization. It pulled you back to the epicenter of, we work with people who have life-limiting illnesses and life-altering illnesses. And so this idea of being able to be out in the other ripples for you guys might not actually be a reality, because it pulls you right back in because there's too many similarities. What do you guys think about that conceptualization?
I mean, I think that's true, but also true for another reason, in that having social media has allowed me to form personal connections with a lot of people over the computer. Mm-hmm. And so as I was writing about the effect of the loss of 2 online and 1, in real life friends over the past week, thinking, I have not met 2 of these people in person. We've had conversations, we've exchanged, somewhat intimate details in these support groups. But it's not like their parents know who I am, or necessarily their kids. And so this, how much right do I have to grieve, and trying to figure out where you fit in the ripples, because you have a very particular connection. But if you were to show up at the funeral, people aren't going to know who you are, because you share this illness. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It absolutely does. Any other thoughts from anybody in the chat at all, or just kind of letting it all sink in? Okay, well, let's move forward then. So here's one of my favorite analogies. Grief, I wish I could tell you, is going to get smaller over time. Grief doesn't get smaller. We grow around it. The loss of your spouse or your child or your brother or sister or mother or father or whomever it might be, best friend, is this big, whatever that this big is. And that is the piece of your soul that feels sucked out as you think about the loss of that person. And we have this desperate belief that we can somehow shrink that grief and not look at it and not address it. And if we just don't say their name, we just won't remember them. You know, all these weird games we play. When in fact, that game is completely fruitless, because our goal and our need for good grief, if it sounds weird to say, but to do grief well, we need to become bigger around that grief. That grief stays the same size. The love for my mother doesn't change. The love for my brother or sister doesn't change size metaphorically. My job is to grow bigger around it. And in that, I don't subscribe to the time heals all wounds, yet another platitude. Time does give us, thumbs down. Time does give us the capacity to grow bigger, right? to be more. Early on, the expectation is that like that bottom left ball almost is the full container. That's grief at the beginning. And to expect somebody to act as if they're the third jar is absolutely ludicrous, because they can't. But yet our society demands that, right? If it's not the right kind of death, you can't take FEMLA. If it's not the right association, you can't do this. If you need to go to somebody to get a magic signature that they take more time off, when maybe you're not willing to share. There's all sorts of societal components to this, but really to conceptualize, it's not about making the grief go away or shrink, because I can't make the love for that person go away. I don't want to make the love for that person go away. I don't want to make their influence on my life go away. I don't want to make the good times, the bad times, the ugly times, the scary times either, when I've gained enough perspective, I guess, from the intensity of that first jar on the left bottom. What do you guys think about the concept of growing around your grief versus demanding that it become smaller?
I strongly think there's some of the early processes that do get better, right? That initial very painful time. But I personally think these things get better to a certain place, and that's it, right? And then the rest of how you go forward is how you manage it from there. And I actually would pretty strongly agree that I don't think better completely to me kind of means gone completely, and that's really not what I don't really want that. So
I love in the grief literature, I love hate, I'm saying that sarcastically, when all these writers talk about resolving your grief. My pneumonia resolved, it's as if I never had it. My grief over the death of my loved one has not resolved. I'm sorry. Like, that just doesn't even make sense when we really break down what the word means.
But I think it's something to kind of embrace, is what I'm saying, because to me that means that at some point you can get there. That means that they live on, right? And so that to me is sort of a end point that's been more liberating than painful, right? Because it's not going to go away completely, and that doesn't have to be the worst thing in the world.
Right. Maya, what do you think about this kind of concept?
I really loved the visual, because the way that I had heard about it was it shrinks, but it still, pings around the bottle. And so you still have these moments of it being really intense. But I like the idea of growing around it, because we do, or we can experience, growth from, I don't want to say from the person dying, but as we continue to live and we make meaning and we, go about our life, we learn different coping skills, and the grief is still there because our love for them is still there, but we learn to live with it.
Mm-hmm. Your vessels become bigger. It doesn't just contain the grief. It contains the grief, the sorrow, the joy, the humor, the laughter, the love, the tears. Like all of the pieces of us can be in that larger jar. And there are times when I can speak to my own experience that I need to crawl down that jar and hug that ball and never let go, it feels like, because I just need to have that griefy moment. And you know what? That's fine. That griefy moment might be an anniversary. It might be you know, a birth date, a death date, it might be a holiday, it could be anything. There's grief bursts that happen all the time. Sometimes we just don't know. You're driving down the freeway and all of a sudden you're bawling and you have to pull off to the side. Do any of those things overcome you? At first, it feels like you're going to die from them. But as the vessel grows, whether you can envision that as a jar, I had another person envision it as kind of like concentric circles that kind of pad their grief a little bit, so people can hit on them a little bit harder, but there's more padding there, so they're more resilient. You can conceptualize this any way that you want to. And Maya, I giggled when you were talking about the button in the box concept. We've got that wrong. The box gets bigger, so the ball doesn't hit the button as often, but the ball still hits the button of grief. There's reminders, there's remembrances, there's hopes and dreams, and you know, you sitting around the table at your retirement party and really desperately wanting your best friend to be there, or, you know, whatever these things might be.
You know, Melissa, when you first showed me this model, I really liked it because I thought, yeah, that's where the meaning is. It's in the bigger jar. Like I grew and I, you know, acquired some new skills and I have all these different feelings, but also within there, that's where the meaning came. There wasn't room for it yet when the ball was filling the jar completely.
I think two people, and I'm not comparing grief, so I don't want it to sound like that. So I need to be careful at how I'm going to say this. I see people for all different types of grief. There's a section that are medical related. There's a section that aren't, that are, you know, suicide or murder or something like that. And then just kind of those losses that just happen and nobody knows why. The thing that is more difficult, I think, when you have the grace to know that you can't take anything for granted because of the situations that you're in. I lost a dear friend about 2 months ago to Huntington's, which is a genetically inherited disease that, for lack of a better term, kind of liquefies your brain. I don't know any other better way to say that. So you watch a person go through some pretty significant changes at a very young age. And at first, everybody had the vitriol and the anger and how can this happen and why hasn't science healed us and all this kind of stuff. And then it was funny how the conversation changed as, you know, we've got so many supports and we can live this well, and it's tragic and it doesn't change that. But also, I'm not going to fear what's coming. I'm going to live, I don't know who said this, my best life. It sounds so colloquial, but there's a piece of that that's truthful, that becomes a choice when you're in these circumstances, because nobody's going to guard your mental health for you. Nobody's going to ask you to have a more positive outlook and have you actually listen to that. Nobody's going to, it comes from that internal growth that I am a better person because I walked and companioned and loved Anna. I'm a better person. I am a better, different parent because my first child died. Do I wish I could go back some days and have that not happen? Sure. But really, when I answer the question, would you have done it differently? Most of the time I say no, because I can see that from the perspective of the jar on the right. Not early on. Early on grief, you're the jar on the left. But as we kind of get going, it does change a little bit. And we don't need to feel bad about that change, that growth. It's not leaving them behind. It's not honoring them less. It is actually honoring them more because of, like Angela was saying, kind of that meaning making can be incorporated in this bigger vessel. That was a whole bunch of rambling. I don't know what all that was about, but there you go. Anybody on the chat that has any thoughts or comments on that? I hate it. I love it. I mean, we can talk openly about people who don't resonate with this too.
Cute. We do have one comment about the ripple concept. Previously, Jordan says, when my sister died, who had Loeys-Dietz, they became involved and were concerned that I would add to others' grief, that I was a reminder of the worst that could happen to their loved one with LDS.
Yeah. That you somehow become the poster child for tragedy.
Well, and I think, and I don't want to speak for Jordan here, so you can correct me, Jordan, but people can come back with, well, I don't want to, hear the sad stuff. That's a drag because my kid's newly diagnosed or whatever, but it's part of the story. And Jordan's sister was part of my joy getting to work with her when I knew her, and part of a lot of people's joy too. And so I understand where you were coming from with that concern, but I hope you also know that you sharing your sister's story and sharing yourself with the foundation has brought a lot of joy to people too.
I think maybe you may be tempted to feel that you remind people of their grief or those concerns. I think people, they're appreciative of some connection, some ability to still connect to the things that they have lost and are missing, and brings those memories that bring joy to them. So to me, that I don't think I think most people are happy to have some way, not happy, they're grateful to have some way to connect to people they've lost.
And to see that Jordan was making meaning of her own grief and then turning it into something that in turn helps other people who might have that diagnosis later on. I think, I don't know that I've ever come in contact with somebody who I felt like was doing something to manifest that meaning and been in any way resentful, or it's like that energy is positive, and that's what we want around us, regardless of what brought them to that meaning making.
When we talk about it, it shows people that the jar gets bigger over time. And sometimes you have to be able to see it with somebody else to have the faith that your jar will get bigger.
Oh, I love that, Maya. Yes.
That's the risk of support groups sometimes, isn't it? When people are desperately trying to maybe demonstrate that their jar has gotten a little bit bigger, but yet there's that intensity to kind of suck back and compare stories and do the grief Olympics about whose grief is more, bigger, badder, better, whatever. And so one of the rules in support groups that I lead for grief related issues is that everybody's grief is the biggest they've experienced in that moment. And so comparing it really doesn't do any of us any good. And the people who have the bigger jars can also have those moments of going down and kind of conceptually grabbing that black ball and holding on and maybe having a bad day. And that's also okay. And you come out of that and you kind of figure out what meaning that has for you, that the people who are doing quote unquote better don't always need to be the poster children for grief either, because you can have your own moments and that doesn't make you less impactful to others. It makes you human. It makes you vulnerable. I will borrow Brene Brown's saying of courageous vulnerability. There's no greater courageous vulnerability than to say, today I'm not okay. And today I need something, or I can't do this, or I can set a boundary, or whatever that might look like for people. But especially in their grief, what is your courageous vulnerability? Because you can't be open and honest with everybody, because we live in a world that is very grief averse. And so who are your touchstones that you can share with? Who holds your sacred space for you to cry and laugh in your grief and not judge either one, and just let you be you? And those are all kind of important subcomponents to all the stuff we've been talking about.
Melissa, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tony.
I was just wondering if you could comment on support groups in general. And I would just, by way of background for me, say, for me personally, that's not really been a productive coping mechanism for me. And so I don't want to say that in this setting to sort of turn people away from that thought process, but I do think it speaks to that everybody, again, has their own unique way of kind of managing things. And for me, I don't find that energy productive for my mindset to which I think I've stated in a lot of other forms, is really the healthiest place for me going forward is to not have VEDS be the prism of my or my family's life, even though it's almost inescapable. And so the support groups have not always been a refuge for me personally, and I wonder if what your thoughts are that to the larger group of just advice, coping advice, I guess.
So support groups early on, when people are desperately trying to connect with somebody who has an understanding where you don't need to explain yourself, can be really powerful. I think as we move through our grief, though, the people kind of separate. There's people that need to stay in that depth for much longer. And so most of my support groups have been about child death from medical, from whatever means. Where I started seeing people shake out is that when I had a newbie coming and then the person 5 introductions in said, I'm 20 years out, and they are acting in the group as if they're the bottle on the lower left. Like this, it is as raw as it was day one. The newbie sitting there going, oh my God, I might as well die now. I can't do that for 20 years. So some of the comparison stuff needs to be really highly moderated for. It's okay to say too that the support that I received from the support group has run its course and I need to find another place, another advocacy. Do I need to move forward into leadership? You use tools for as long as they work for you. When the medication no longer works at the dosage, you adjust, right? Why don't we do that with our psychological health? I get fearful when I see people who've been in kind of the same type of support group for 40 years. I wonder what that might do to them unless they're more in a leadership or they're kind of demonstrating the bottle on the lower right. But there definitely is a place for support groups. I'm more leery about the online ones, but I know we are forced to do online. What happens when that person is suicidal and they don't speak up? There's so many things we can't control for, but with good leaders, they can be great. So,
yeah, and please don't I only brought it up. Don't misinterpret it as a indictment, if you will. That more, I just meant to say that I think that like everything else is pretty unique. That it's probably okay for you to know that for some people that's not your best place, or it doesn't seem to work for you. Then that's okay too, because there's lots of other tools. Right, there's lots of other tools in that toolbox. And I brought it up to say, I mean, lots of people say, well, you should meet and talk to these people, and for me personally, probably not as helpful. Now I know sometimes people are in denial about what's helpful for them or not, or don't understand themselves or whatever. But you know. That's probably okay. And that's probably okay about a lot of stuff in terms of how you manage it. I guess there's probably not an exact right answer for anyone, really.
Leader, what do you think?
So I run an online support group for close to 14,000 people with connective tissue disorders around the world.
14,000?
It's a Facebook group. And so it doesn't operate like a typical
AA meeting
support group where where like you go around the circle and I've done some of those. But when my mom thought maybe it would be helpful for me to get involved with a group when I was a teenager, my dad was really reluctant because he was afraid of what the future looked like and that going to a group would show the negative sides. And we're sitting out in the car in the parking lot before my first meeting, and my dad said, are you sure you want to do this? Because when we go in those doors, people might look a certain way, they might share some pretty scary stuff. And I said, but they're gonna look like me. And there was a lot of value for me in going to a room and seeing my face and my body reflected in the people around the table, even though a lot of them were older than me. And there are helpful support groups, I think, and there are some that operate in a way that is less helpful to getting people in a healthy place. I mean, I think it can depend on who's moderating it and what the purpose is and people in the group and whether or not it works for you. Like, they're not for everybody. And my mom, over the years, as I've been more and more involved with the foundation, said, why do you do this? Because you have grief a lot. And if you just quit being involved with this foundation, you wouldn't know all these people who pass away, which is true. I wouldn't. But there's so much that I get from knowing people in the community and those friendships that have to do with more than just a shared diagnosis. that for me, it's really valuable. And so I would say to the, unaffected parents who are listening, to not be afraid of trying it out, whether that's going to a local network group meeting where, we tend to, do activities and we have our walks or our barbecues or whatever, or going to conference. And if it's not for you and your child, it's not for you, but that it's not as necessarily as scary and overwhelming as it might seem. It may be helpful. It may be something to try, another tool in the toolbox, like Tony said, decide whether that's for you or not.
Yeah, and just a couple of things. I want to be really clear. I was not me. I'm really just brought it up as sort of a discussion point. So number one, and I wanted to sort of separate the notion of support groups versus getting involved, right? And getting involved doesn't have to take. There's a infinite number of ways you can get involved. The vast majority of which I can't imagine are anything but productive for most people. But support groups is just sort of one component of that has, I suspect, tons of pros, but may not be for everyone all the time.
And I think that goes back to even what we've been talking about is the uniqueness of your journey. That as important as it is to know what tools are out there, it is equally important to know when a tool isn't working for you and be okay with saying, not for me, but I'm willing to try X, Y, Z instead of not for me. I'm going to crawl back in my hole and act as if it's not existing. Those are different constructs, of course, but I was able to go to New Zealand and share with some grief. Any of you get to travel, go there. And the thing I took back from that conference was honor your grief. Just honor it. Whatever it looks like for you is what it is for you. And that is tragic and beautiful and sad and lovely and warming and growth oriented and all these other words that we could throw at it, but it is uniquely yours. And so deciding what works for you, as long as you're trying, as long as you're figuring that piece out and not being kind of that apathetic bystander, hoping that somebody will read your mind and help or, do it for you. That's kind of a different way of looking at the situation. But post-traumatic growth and the trauma of a diagnosis, trauma of death is all about looking at your toolbox and picking the right tool for the job at hand. And having a breath, having a lot of different ideas in that it is what's going to help you become the most adept at dealing with your grief.
So I want to circle back to a question because I know we're kind of coming up to a wrap up point here, but one of the first questions that was asked, and I think we've touched on this, but I would love just sort of like as a summary, bringing it back around. So there's someone who asked, she has Marfan, lost her mother and brother very recently, both due to Marfan and surgeries that were repair surgeries. And how do I go on without being terrified of the same thing happening to me? And I think we've hit on some of that, but we're talking about tools, and I'm just curious, like, Maya, you mentioned your group and some different things, but to me, this kind of like puts a bow on it. Here's this whole thing. We've talked all these pieces, but like when you're living within a condition and losing people with that same condition, how do you do that? Like practically, what do you do?
Go ahead.
I'd personally say that's a scary that very few people understand, right? So, and whatever they want to tell you, they do. This could happen to us or whatever that people say, but that's a scary that very few people understand, to watch very close people to you die of the same thing that you are at risk for. So in my personal opinion, acknowledging that, right, and is a helpful way forward, and acknowledging that's you're sort of facing a different set of emotional circumstances that most people have to deal with their mortality. And then for me personally, and again, most everything's personal, right? But I think somewhere you got to decide that I'm going to get busy living or I'm going to get busy dying. And that's not always easy, but
it is an everyday decision. It has to be. It's kind of that choice to be victimized by my diagnosis or living with my diagnosis. Those are two different mindsets.
And everybody's different, but for me, that manifests. I don't think it's denial, but I think it's saying that that's just not going to be the prism of my life, right? And I, for me, and I've said this many times, but father, physician, friend, I'd rather you think of all that before you think of VEDS.
You are so much more than this diagnosis.
Right, that's the way. Right, but I think that starts in your own brain. I guess is what I'm saying. Right.
Yeah.
I think it's part of me, but it's just part of me.
Yep.
And when I go, whenever that is, I want to be able to look and say, I didn't spend my entire time being afraid of
what
could happen.
Yep.
I want to be able to look back and say, I did this. And therapy helps. Like a good therapist who has experience working with people with chronic illness and loss, I think is really valuable, whether that's short-term or long-term, but finding the right fit. And I have a best friend in the community who, when I'm having those days where I'm overwhelmed, it just, when you have days when you're afraid, to be able to go to her and be like, okay, I need to dump. Can I dump? And, she does the same thing with me. And we talk about the fears, because the fears are valid, right? Like when you've seen this happen to your loved ones, you can't just say, well, it's not going to happen to me, because it could. And so having somebody that gets it to process it with. And the other piece of advice, I guess I have, my college roommate had a syndrome called Eisenmenger syndrome, which is a really rare cardiac and pulmonary condition. And she ended up passing away from like a freak accident when we were 30. And she used to say that when she would feel grief, then she would take the day to completely feel it and just own it, that today was a day when she was going to grieve for, bad medical news or whatever. And then she would the next day wake up and say, okay, what am I going to do today that's going to be productive? Because I can't grieve about this indefinitely, because it's always going to be something. And then she would find some task to do or social engagement to go to or something until the next time that she needed to feel it. And so I've, tried to adapt that too. And so when I'm having those fears, I just acknowledge them, that this is what they are and I feel it. And then the next day I try to just take the next step forward and keep on living for what I hope is a long time.
Not be paralyzed by the what ifs, the when wills, all those things. Yeah.
Super hard, easier said than done.
For
Right.
real. Oh my
Right?
gosh.
Yeah.
When you said Maya, you were like, yeah, they're peace out. Gosh, there's some times where we just want to peace out as well, isn't there? And we just don't have that luxury, unfortunately. Angela, do we have time to do the next couple of slides, or do we want to? Okay, just wanted to be. Let's switch a little bit to what to say to someone in grief, and this is not exhaustive. This is not exhaustive. We could write compendiums of books about this kind of stuff. But some of the best things is I'm just so very sorry, and that's different than, oh, I'm sorry. Do you hear the tone difference? Oh, I'm sorry. Sad to hear that. I'm so very sorry. What, be there in the moment. Acknowledging that you wish you had the right words, that there's nothing that you can say that will magically make this better for them. Just like nothing anybody else said for you, suddenly was the rainbows and glitter. And it's like, oh gosh, I feel so much better now. It's just a process of being, but just know I care. I'm always just a phone call away, letting yourself be open. A lot of people in early grief, especially when it's a traumatic grief, something that I think about some of the dissection situations, and just like one moment they're here, one moment they're not, kind of moments. And some people can't really verbalize it to talk to somebody. So texting, I've had people communicate solely in emojis. And if that's what they need to do, that's okay. Some of the worst things we've hit on, a couple of them, at least he, she, they lived a good life. Oh my gosh. They are in a better place. There's a reason for everything. God needed another flower in his garden. They did what they came here to do and their time was up. all very nice Hallmarkian kind of ideas, but none of them honor the depth of grief and allow you to be more than that sentiment. I want to remind you guys that sometimes it's not the words at all. It's your silence as they share, and not filling it with your own experience, but just holding space for whatever they're saying. A real or virtual hug. Clearly we have to honor COVID restrictions, and there's so many different medical components of this, but how can you hug in different ways, metaphorically? Is it verbal? Is it emotional? Is it online in one of the groups that I participate in? Before you're able to log off, you need to give a virtual hug. And it sounds so silly, but there's something about human connection that I think we've recognized that we miss during this time of COVID. One of my favorites is the insinuating a hug in messaging or on Facebook or whatever, as I put it in parentheses. But I also don't just say hugs. I say deep supportive hug, Meg, and I use their name. Use the name of people's loved ones who died. They don't suddenly become nameless. It's not like you're going to remind them that Bob's not here anymore. They know, viscerally, they know. So this kind of idea about coming together and not fixing for, and something we talk a lot about in our work is bearing the unbearable. Somehow you just kind of do it, and there's no right or wrong to that doing it. But in supporting one another, their journey might be different, and their way of doing it might be different. And if it's working, who am I to say, please stop? That's not really, you're not doing it right. Chapter 7 of Kluber-Ross's book says you should do this. Not going to be helpful. What other ways have you guys received support that was meaningful for you? That wasn't the Hallmark platitude?
I can say categorically over many, many times, and some I've applied to my own life, is that if you feel some sense of reaching out, then do it. Yes. And that, so I didn't know him well enough or whatever, I wouldn't send it. I can say across the board, the times that I have felt most comfort has been by people I did not expect to reach out, because Uncle Joe is going to be there and whoever else, but the people you don't expect, it's meaningful. And I've actually personally applied that to myself as sort of a legacy of these people that I miss, because I've kind of learned to say, if I think about it, then I'm going to do it. And I think sort of in remembrance of them almost. So yeah. I think if you think about it, do it. And honestly, there's no right way to do any of that. If you are sharing someone's grief, that feels better to them, whatever that form that takes.
I love you might not get that is. Yes.
You're not going to get a perfect whatever. Maybe it's a hug. Maybe it's just you're there. Maybe whatever. Yeah. The fact that you showed up in some way is meaningful.
Absolutely.
I think sharing memories, like you said, saying their name, sharing the memories has been really helpful to me. Hearing that my loved one meant something to other people.
That's right. Yeah.
And sometimes those were stories that I hadn't heard before. And so it was another, I was learning something new about my loved one. And sometimes food, dropping off a meal with no expectation of seeing or talking to the person, or, sending something in the mail, like culturally that can be a really important thing or valuable thing. Just some way of letting people know, especially after the funeral, because everybody's there for the first few days. And then afterwards, it gets really quiet and you're alone with your thoughts, and having people check in the weeks and months after a loss, I think is really helpful.
And I actually think the best, in my personal opinion, is that the best way to do that is to give them an out, though. So basically say, I'm sorry, you don't have to call back. You don't have to acknowledge, you don't have to do anything, right? Unless you want to. So I'm sure I've sent texts that said, I'm sorry about this, text me back if you want, but you don't have to.
Yeah. Not forcing ourselves on anyone else is important. Do I have time for one quick little story, Angela? What time are we supposed to end? 5:30? No, wait, it's 5:30 here. Sorry. Okay, so one of my grief mamas, her son died from a congenital illness. Didn't know, had it just died, and then found out why later, congenital asplenia. And he had used the TV as a touchscreen, because that's what all kids now that are 3, 4, and 5 do. And in order to help, another mother came in and wanted to help clean the house. Lovely idea, but she went to wipe off those fingerprints. Oh no, no. In your help, do what you can to honor with openness, with the ability to say, no, that's not quite right yet. And I'm here. Whatever that might turn into. I love you, a little emoji, a little text, a little, I'm thinking about you, whatever, with no expectation of return. But also don't assume that you know their grief so well that you can take care of some of it for them. And will always be my reminder story of seeing her face when they were going to go wipe those little handprints away. And that, oh, everybody stop, just don't move. Let's process what we're going to do here, because that's all in that moment. That's all she had left, were those little fingerprints. So there's lots of those grief moments.
This has been just such a great discussion. I am so grateful to each of you for sharing your experience and your heart with everyone who joined us live. This also has been recorded, and we will be sharing it out with everyone who registered, and then across, it'll be available to everyone when it is needed, and people can always circle back as well. So, as we wrap up, I don't know, do you have any closing thoughts, Maya or Tony, that you would like to share? Not to put you on the spot, but but to put you on the spot, I guess.
Go ahead, Maya.
I'm grateful for this community and for the opportunity that we had to have this workshop tonight, because it's a difficult subject. It's not an easy one to talk about, and especially when we try to be really positive about the future and our identities and all of that, it can be easy to say, well, we shouldn't talk about this because we need to look to the future. But I think it's a very important topic. And so I'm glad that we've been able to have this discussion tonight. And I hope we can have other, discussions in the future. And I would want people to know that the foundation is there for them, and other people in the community are there for them if they want to continue the conversation, later, that's possible.
I would just say thanks to all of you. Actually, thanks to the panelists here. Thanks, Maya, for sharing your thoughts in your heart. And I'm really appreciative too that there's I always say I'm sort of stuck here. We're sort of stuck here because of the way things went, and just from sheer luck, or however you want to put it. But there are also people who are here helping us who aren't stuck here, and I'm very appreciative that there are professionals and people with big hearts out there who are trying to be helpful.
So on that note, I will just throw out there too that if a virtual support group is something that feels right for you, or is something you want to experiment with or check in on, we do offer a series of those around different topics. There are VEDS specific topics, and then there are some for our Marfan and Loeys-Dietz communities as well. You can find out more about those on all the websites, thevedsmovement.org, marfan.org, or loeys-dietz.org. Also, our on-staff nurse is always available for questions, whether they be physical, mental health, really anything connected with the community. So the easiest way to get there is marfan.org/ask. And, she's wonderful. And if she doesn't have the answer to your question right off the bat, she will connect you with the people that can get you what you need. We are here, and when I say we, I mean the Marfan Foundation and all of our divisions. We are here to serve this community. We want what is best for each and every one of you. Thank you for posting that link, Maya. And so that means getting you the answers to your questions and the support you need in whatever form it may take. And if you have suggestions for other topics like this, I do want to continue. Melissa and I have talked about wanting to continue to explore some different topics related to grief. There are lots of ways to peel this onion because it's a big topic in our community. So we want to continue that discussion. So if you have ideas, I'd love to hear about them and see what we can do to put those together. With that, thank you again to Tony, Maya, Melissa. This has been wonderful. And yeah, have a great evening wherever you are. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.